be that way. Life can be more than your work, and you can love your job, but it doesn't have to be your everything. And now I want to help others go through those reflections and have that clarity, because I didn't get that until I was already in my 40s. So it took a really long time. And I think younger generations are better at this, disassociating their work from their life. But now I help others figure that out. I was, pregnant and, do I go on mission to Somalia? Do I fly off to Somalia? Like, I mean, there has been all the things. The year that COVID hit, I had just gotten pregnant and I had trips booked that month, and I was no longer with the UN. I was with a social impact consulting firm, but I had trips that year booked to Lebanon, Somalia, and Nigeria. And a lot of them got canceled because of COVID, but it's like, do you fly off to Mogadishu at 12 weeks, 15 weeks, 16 weeks pregnant? I mean, I have colleagues that do, I have colleagues that still do that, and it's a personal decision, but you start to have to make those decisions between your career and your family, and how do you do it? How do you balance it? People keep talking about filling the gap. How are we going to fill the gap? How are we going to fill the gap? We're not going to fill the gap. We're not going back. There is no more gap. The entire structure has shifted. The entire architecture of international development and the way that we provide support is going to have to shift. And yes, we can lament a system that is now being dismantled, and we can take a minute to do that, and we can be sad and we can grieve, particularly for those who have lost their careers, but we can also look at it as an opportunity to rebuild and build back better.
Invisible Experts Podcast.
Welcome everyone to this new episode of Invisible Experts. Today we have such a terrific guest, Kelsi Kriitmaa. Is it okay pronounced?
Yeah, perfect. Well done.
Well, Kelsi has such an incredible experience in different areas. She's a coach, she's an expert on social impact. She also works in health. She worked, I would say, around the world, or a lot of places around the world.
Yeah.
So for me, it's fantastic. I just came across with you and your work through LinkedIn. God bless. We can connect now, online and meeting such inspiring people. Kelsi, thank you so much for giving up your time. I'm pretty sure our small community who are learning about sustainable enterprises, sustainable organizations, which include social impact, social enterprises, I'm pretty sure they're going to learn a lot from you. So how are you?
Great. Thanks, Andres. Thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Fantastic. Let's start just to contextualize.
Sure.
I know it can be profound who you are, but, just tell us who you are, what you're up to, and now what you're actually focusing on.
Sure. Well, I'll give you the cliff notes and try not to bore you by reading my CV. So who am I? So as you said, I've been working in social impact for almost 20 years now, almost 2 decades, which makes me feel a lot older than I feel in my heart. But yeah, so I'm originally from Canada, and I originally started my career in global health. So I have a PhD in epidemiology, which quite honestly, I don't think a large portion of the world knew what epidemiologists were until we had the COVID pandemic. And then all of a sudden, I think people in my circle understood a little bit better what I'd worked on for a large part of my life. So a large part of my career was in global health. I worked for UN agencies and NGOs on the African continent, in the Middle East, across Asia, working with governments to plan and implement and evaluate health programs. So I really started off in more vertical disease programs, looking at HIV studies and prevalence and services for migrants and refugees and mobile populations. I did that for many, many years. So development health programs, moved into humanitarian work, spent a lot of time in Somalia and South Sudan, and had, just this really beautiful over a decade based out of East Africa, working with communities around global health. After that, careers evolve, people evolve. I took a position with the UN in Geneva about a decade ago now. And it was an interesting experience, but I very quickly at a very young age realized that I loved working with communities on the ground, but working for a UN agency at headquarters was not exactly the same impact. Didn't have the same feelings. I didn't have the same connection to the work. And so I did a pretty big career pivot and I left the UN. And I moved to a social impact consulting firm. And that's when I got a little bit more into philanthropy. So I worked at philanthropy and CSR and working with corporate foundations and family foundations to craft social impact strategies. And then a couple of years ago, I left that organization. I was a COO there for a couple of years and I really enjoyed it. And I started my own company. So I do coaching and consulting, still in the social impact space, a little bit more human-sized projects. For anyone who's ever worked in consulting out there, it can feel a little soul-sucking at times. And while I loved working for a social impact firm, it started to take its toll. You know, I'm a mother, I have a family, I have a beautiful life in Geneva, and my identity was really tied around my work. So after a sabbatical, I started my own company, and now I do about 60% coaching with people in the social impact sector. So across foundations, UN, social enterprises, government, etc. And then I still do about 40% coaching with very human-sized projects in the social impact sector.
Wow.
Yeah.
It seems that you live like 300 years of life, you know?
Oh,
Kelsi,
it feels that way sometimes, Andres. It really does.
I know, and also like, you know, it's very interesting how you've been evolving and now you ended up in coaching, which I want to talk a little bit later.
Yeah.
But first of all, I want to ask you about what inspired you to work with communities, you know? Is it this Canadian like vibe or what is it coming from? Because, you know, you
Yeah.
could have gone through corporate, you could have gone to other fields.
Yeah. You know, it's a good question. I think about this a lot because I coach a lot of people in the social impact sector, and I often ask them, why did you get started in this field? Because oftentimes the reason we started in this sector is not the reason we stay, because it can be a really tough sector, particularly for career growth and stability. It actually goes back to my childhood. I remember this story when I remember vividly when I was younger. It was a Christmas, and you know, Christmas brings up a lot of emotions and a lot of memories for people. And I was younger. I had a brother and a sister, and my parents were divorced, but we had these beautiful Christmases. You know, Christmases at two houses, lots of presents. We had so much abundance. We had so much access to things. When you're younger, you don't really think of gratitude. This is like a buzzword now that everyone talks about. But I remember at a very young age thinking, wow, we had a lot. We had a lot of stuff. We had a lot of access. We had a beautiful family. And I remember having feelings of gratitude at a very young age, compounded with feelings of sadness that people in our community didn't all have access to the same abundance. And I remember having this conversation with my mom at a very young age. I remember being very upset by it. So I think it started off with this empathy at a very young age of wanting to look at inequities in communities to see how I could contribute to that. And I was really fortunate that after my undergraduate degree, and then after my graduate work, I knew I wanted to be in health to some degree, but I was very grateful to land an internship with the Canadian government that placed me with a UN agency in Nairobi, Kenya, very early on in my career. So I got access to go and work with communities very early on, and that changed the course of my career, launched it into international development.
Wow, that's very nice.
Yeah.
So, how you started to work in coaching because it's kind of connecting, right?
Yeah.
I think coaching is a great tool to develop empathy, you know,
Yeah.
structurally to understand who you are working with, who you are collaborating with. Why coaching?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it's something that I've reflected on a lot. And there's a long answer and a short answer. And the short answer is when you heard me at the top of the podcast tell you a bit about my career and my story and my path, you might have seen that there were a couple huge and important inflection points in my career where I did drastic changes. I worked for the UN for a decade. I quit. I didn't know what I was doing next, but then I found this role at a social impact consulting firm. I was a COO there. I quit. I didn't know what I was going to do next. I took 6 months off and then I started my own coaching and consulting company. I went through these huge career inflection points where I did not have any support. I had dabbled, I'd gotten a coach a couple different times, but they didn't necessarily work in social impact. I felt like they were very corporate. They didn't understand the nuances of our sector. And I took these huge risks in my career because that was my personality. I felt comfortable doing that. But now I want to help others who are going through these inflection points, whether it's a lack of clarity or a lack of satisfaction or joy in their career, or maybe they've stagnated, or maybe they really are exceptionally interested in making a shift that could be within social impact or out of it, but they want to have this purpose in their lives. And there are ways to do this without huge risk to you, your family, your livelihood. There are ways to go through career reflections and to change the course of your life. And particularly for me, my identity was so wrapped up in my work. As a humanitarian worker being deployed to emergencies and crisis settings, I was my job was me for over a decade. And it took me really going through a period of exhaustion and burnout and self-reflection to see that doesn't have to be that way. Life can be more than your work and you can love your job, but it doesn't have to be your everything. And now I want to help others go through those reflections and have that clarity because I didn't get that until I was already in my 40s. So it took a really long time. And I think younger generations are better at this, disassociating their work from their life. But now I help others figure that out.
Wow, that's great. So do you agree, like when you get into coaching, I had a coach, okay?
Hmm.
So I was kind of like, yeah, I had a coach and it was great.
Hmm.
I was through this process of transformation and it helped me a lot.
Yeah.
So, as a coach, would you think it's very important to expose ourselves, to talk to someone, to perhaps express our feelings, even if it's a professional coach? I think it's all interconnected, right? Sometimes I suppose it's really hard to separate ourselves from work because still we are not robots, right? We have
Yeah.
good days, bad days, and so on. So what I was trying to say is like how important it is for people who work in our sector
Mhm.
to, have a coach around and have some sessions and so on. What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, I'd be the pot calling the kettle black if I said, no, nobody needs coaching.
No,
And
no,
it's
but
not
it's
just
okay.
not just because I'm promoting the sector, but Andres, I'd love to hear more about your coaching experience and why did you seek a coach and what kind of coach you sought? Because there's a few myths around the coaching sector, but the first thing to really mention is there's been a proliferation of the industry. It's a billion-dollar industry now, and particularly after COVID, where a lot of people have done a lot of self-development and reflection on what they want their lives to look like after that global pandemic and global crisis. I think everyone can benefit from coaching, just like everyone can benefit from therapy. But oftentimes the two are confused. And certainly there are similarities, but I think the number one thing you need to look at with coaching is uh, always to find a provider that's certified, to find somebody that has experience. There's different types of coaches out there. There's wellness and health and career and leadership. And there's relationship coaches, there's breakup coaches. I mean, coach is just a term that can be applied to almost anything. So the same way if you were going to therapy, you would look for somebody with a certain set of credentials or somebody who's an expert in what you're going there for. It's the same thing with a coach. So I have coaches that I go to, and I have a business coach and I've had, career coach at different places in my life. But if you are going, or anyone in the sector in social impact is going through any of what I sort of see as the three overarching pillars of where coaches can help you. The first is career clarity. Where are you going? Like, what do you want to do? Where do you get your career satisfaction? Where is your ikigai? Have you ever heard of this concept before?
The Japanese one, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
Ikigai, yeah.
the listeners out there, it's really finding the intersection of what are you good at? What do you love to do? What will someone pay you to do? And what does the world need? And one of these misnomers is that anyone who works in social impact must love their job or must be doing good for the world. But as we know, and this is not me being cynical, that's not always the case. So a coach can help you get that clarity, that clarity around what you want your life, what's your purpose, what brings you joy. And the second part of coaching can then really be in this industry, transitional coaching. So that can mean like a search strategy and helping you, with your networking, helping you with your interviewing and all the tools you need to find a new career path. And then the third element is really leadership development. So that's where you want to improve your leadership skills. You want to look at your executive presence, your communications, your strategy, all these types of things. And so for me, you can see that's a cycle that anyone who has a job in social impact might be at one of those inflection points. And I think that's where coaching has its value.
Yeah, no, no, for sure. I mean, as I told you before, I went through the process.
Yeah, tell me a bit about it.
It was great. I mean, like what I was trying to say is also you untapped your inner self, right?
Mhm.
Because as I said before, at the end of the day, we project who we are onto our real life, right? It could be
Yeah.
work, it could be our partnership, it could be with our kids as a parent, with our family. So I agree with you. I mean, it's this way to find clarity
Mhm.
and have a very safe space to talk to someone
Yeah.
and being helped to express yourself without intervening, right?
Yeah.
So, because I had both, I have a psychotherapy and I have a coach at the same time. They were different people, right?
Yeah.
So it was a great experience because psychotherapy helped me to kind of meet my own demons, looked, be aware of my traumas, and
Yeah.
then coach, it kind of pushed me forward,
Yes.
and
Andres,
then
that's beautiful the way you said that. I couldn't have said it better myself. And honestly, you're my dream client. Clients that are working on their internal traumas and working on emotional regulation and all these things that you can do with your therapist. But then as a coach, we're your accountability partner. And my coaching practice focuses on really it's values-based coaching and it's goal alignment. We identify your goals. What are they? And I'm your accountability partner to help you get there in a positive psychology methodology, but I'm not a trained psychologist. I am a coach and I will help you set those goals, meet those goals. We'll tackle your limiting beliefs. What are your mindsets that are holding you back? Because we all have these stories that we tell ourselves in our head that hold us back, whether it's fear or lack of confidence. And we do tackle those in coaching.
yeah, I actually think you guys unleash this wisdom within trauma,
Mm.
like your compatriot Gabor Mate, right?
Yeah.
He talked about,
Canadian, by the way.
yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying, Canadian.
Yeah.
So he talked about these wounds that we all have, right?
Yeah.
And then I think the work that you guys do it to unleash such wisdom
Yeah.
and project it, especially in our sector, in a
Yeah.
good way, is beautiful. So for me, it was the best, I would say, process in my life.
Oh, I
Uh,
love hearing that.
yeah, no, definitely. I mean,
Well,
very worth. I mean, it should be. I mean, it has to be an investment, right?
yeah.
I mean, mental health is something that sometimes is overlooked, and it's
Yeah.
so important.
Yeah.
As we invest in our professional career,
Mm.
studying, capacity building and so on. But I think investing in mental health is important. And also, coaching is the way, as I said before, to look into the future, but with better clarity. So
Yeah.
it helped, but I'm an working process, right? I'm an
Oh,
ongoing working process. I mean,
we all
I think
are.
it would never stop.
Yeah.
And sometimes I take breaks because it
Yeah.
can be tough, right?
Of course. And I think that's natural. I also think, what you said a minute ago about it being an investment, it's a process. One of the challenges of the coaching industry is that it's not democratized. I mean, there isn't access through everybody. I think traditionally coaching was very available in the private sector,
Mm.
executive coaches and business coaches and sales coaches, meet your KPIs, work for these companies, increase shareholder value. And I've seen it proliferating much more in the social impact sector. I mean, 10 years ago, when I looked for a social impact coach, it was really hard to find. I think there was maybe one. Now I have a lot of peers in the sector, not as many as other types of coaches, but they do exist. But our services are at a price point where it is not necessarily accessible to anyone. And that's one of my goals of also getting into coaching is to ensure that accessibility to those who need it and not just the senior leaderships at these large international organizations or mission-driven companies to have access, but to come up with models and products and services or group coaching programs that everyone can access at every stage of their career. And it's something that I talk to a lot. I talk about unlocking coaching for the sector. So we talk to people in change and HR and organizational development and leadership teams around how can we invest in your teams. So I talk a lot to big NGOs and foundations and UN agencies around helping them to look at it as an investment in their teams and lowering attrition in the sector, because a lot of people do get burnt out in this sector and they don't have access to the resources, including coaching, to help them live these sustainable careers. It's a real challenge.
Yeah. I have kind of like two questions, right?
Sure.
The first one is from your, users, let's say,
Mhm.
or your clients. So would you be able to maybe identify three general struggles that
Mm,
people in our sector,
yeah.
faced too? And then
Yeah.
the other question is, you mentioned before your connection with the community, how much you enjoy it, and then
Mhm.
you go into a bigger institution, which, I suppose is more bureaucratic, UN is massive, there is a lot of red tape. And I would love to ask you whether through coaching, you also found clarity, right? On your new path.
Yeah. Man, how much time do we have? Okay. Okay, let's start with the first one.
As much as you can, as much as you want.
I don't want to bore you or your listeners to
No,
death.
come on, please.
Okay, let's do the first one. So some of the common challenges I see across my practice. And just to say, my clients, I generally don't coach early career professionals. It's usually mid-career. So people maybe 5 years experience, but most of my clients are between 10 and 25 years of experience. And even that is a large spectrum. But these are people that have already invested in their social impact careers for some period of time. So it's not new graduates out of grad school, for example. The first major challenge that I see is people where their identity is completely wrapped up in their work. So because social impact, the mission is so important. We're fighting for equity, social change, justice. The stakes are high. The programs that we're doing are not only saving lives, and not to sound grand and important, but they are. The programs are actually saving lives, whether you're a frontline responder or it's the program proposal you're writing at HQ in London or Geneva or New York. It's truly impactful. You're spending taxpayer dollars, you're spending philanthropic dollars, you're spending other people's resources to help communities in need. And the sector has huge challenges around inequity, needs to be decolonized, all these different things, but there's this weight on your shoulders. And oftentimes you're doing it in poor resource settings where your organization doesn't have the funding, you're holding multiple hats. It's a lot of pressure, it's a lot of stress. And so these individuals, their entire identity is tied around their work. Now, what happens when that's the case is, what if work is going bad? How can you have anything positive in life if your entire identity is wrapped up in your professional achievements? So I was like this for many, many years, and I didn't even realize it. But if work was not going swimmingly, I could not be happy outside of work. So that's one of the first huge things that we address with my clients. The second is, and this is particularly amongst high achieving, type A, ambitious, particularly women in this sector, where they have devoted years and often decades to this sector. And then they get to a place where they say, actually, I want to have a family. I want to have a life outside of this work. This is particularly the case for humanitarians. You know, I worked across Somalia and South Sudan, acute crisis settings. I have friends and colleagues and peers that did as well. Having a family, when you have those kind of travel demands or those kind of geographical situations where you're based in countries and camps and whatnot, is exceptionally challenging. And even for non-humanitarians, I work with a lot of social impact executives where they have worked their butts off for 20 years to get to the director level, the C-suite level. They have the title, they have the salary, they have the influence. They get there and they're exhausted. They're so tied up in this, well, I worked so hard to get here, I should be happy. I ticked the box. And something is missing. They're just not. And usually it's because they're on their way to burnout, because they're so exhausted having gotten there. They got there, but guess what? The benchmark has then moved. So that's sort of the second bucket. And the third bucket, of like major reflection and challenges that I see in my clients are people that think because they entered the social impact sector for whatever reason that was, at whatever age or stage of their career, they think they have to stay there forever and that they don't have transferable skills to go elsewhere, where actually our lives are not private sector or public sector anymore. You know, you work in social enterprises. There's so much blending. Not to mention there are transferable skills there. I have clients who have gone from private to public and back again. Myself have gone across both of those overarching sectors. There are transferable skills and there are ways to do this. A career is not a linear path. It's messy. We're messy humans, and that's okay. And so just empowering our social impact colleagues to know that just because you started in this sector, you're not stuck there. We can help you find the joy again, or we can help you leave if that's ultimately what you want. Does that make
Wow.
sense?
No, totally, totally. And how about you? I mean, how
I have
it,
been in all three of those buckets.
okay.
That was me across all three. Burnout, identity tied to work, got the title and the remuneration and all the things, and then realized, like, what am I doing? Had points in my life where I was, pregnant and, do I go on mission to Somalia? Do I fly off to Somalia? Like, I mean, there has been all the things. The year that COVID hit, I had just gotten pregnant and I had trips booked that month, and I was no longer with the UN. I was with a social impact consulting firm, but I had trips that year booked to Lebanon, Somalia, and Nigeria. And a lot of them got canceled because of COVID, but it's like, do you fly off to Mogadishu at 12 weeks, 15 weeks, 16 weeks pregnant? I mean, I have colleagues that do, I have colleagues that still do that, and it's a personal decision, but you start to have to make those decisions between your career and your family. And how do you do it? How do you balance it? The biggest misnomer that I've ever heard about women in careers is you can have it all. You can have the family, you can have the job, you can have the benefits, you can have the perfect work-life integration. Women cannot have it all. You can have different things at different times. You have to pick your non-negotiables and your seasons of life, but it's very, very difficult to have it all and still have any sense of integration and balance. So that was a little bit of a tangent, but just to show you where I've been on that trajectory of, my client challenges.
Of course, of course. I think a huge topic that I come across with you is help, right? Because you've been to humanitarian work and then you are coaching and in a way still help, right?
Yeah, I hope so.
And I was thinking like help, it it carries out this such a burden, right? Because help is hard. Sometimes help, it doesn't really depends on you, right? On oneself. It also depends on this kind of reciprocal relationship with others. So I was wondering for you, help has also helped yourself
Mm.
through these years, and whether how important is to help in general, right?
Yeah, well, I think it's just who I am. I mean, from a very young age, I want to feel like I'm building authentic engagements with everyone around me. If you ever listen to my friends or my husband, the number one thing I always talk about is community. And to me, that means giving and taking. That's what community is, right? Being there to support one another. And I think that came across early on in my career. And even now, I don't do as much social impact consulting work now, but I'm on multiple boards to different levels where I'm, getting my hands dirty and doing the work. But I think it's either innate or it's not. I get energy and I get joy from helping others. I get off a coaching call with a client and I'm energized. I'm excited. I cannot wait to talk to them again, to hear what they're doing, how they're moving forward, what their challenges are, unpacking their blockages and, helping them move forward. So I get joy out of it. It's innate. It's just who I am. I'm trying to imagine having gone into another career path. And I've had many career paths now, because again, life is messy. It all seems natural now, how it all unfolded, but gosh, while you're living it, it sure doesn't seem organic,
Yeah.
does it?
Has it changed since you were a mother? Because this is my experience, right?
Yeah.
Like, back in the day, I used to travel a lot. I used to be in places that sometimes can be tough, as you said before, Somalia, South
Yeah.
Sudan. But, as a parent now, this constant, fear, because now
Yeah.
you have, maybe in my case, I have two kids, and then sometimes I'm like, oh my God, I can't face anything. But, when I think about them, this overprotective persona just arise. And then, help also sometimes, means that you have to risk yourself. So how do you balance it? Because
Gosh, I wish I had a perfectly eloquent answer for you.
now it doesn't, it just,
Yeah,
I
no,
guess,
I mean, it's an art and a science, right? I think, as I said earlier, it's really hard. Being an adult is hard, being a parent is hard, being a working parent is hard, all the things, right? And I think the number one factor that has contributed to me I have a really beautiful life. I have a career that I've designed by choice. I have a beautiful family. And I think one of the biggest contributing factors to that is I have an incredible partner who still allows me to have a thriving career. He has a thriving career, and we've built this life together where we give and take. It's not 50-50. There are days where it's all him or all me. And I'm very grateful that I can still have the career I have and be incredibly ambitious, but still be a mother. Am I flying off to Mogadishu and Juba and Kabul and all the places like I would have before? No. Will I not go to those places anymore? Absolutely. That's not a hard no. I mean, if there was an interesting mission and an assignment and I believed in it and I could be there, I mean, just from a personal anecdote, when there's an emergency across the globe right now with the Myanmar earthquake a couple weeks ago, I had this profound sense of I am futile, I am useless. I'm sitting here in Geneva when I have friends deploying to Myanmar within 24 hours to go help with the emergency. or something happens in Somalia or Kabul or whatnot, I still have this desire of like, I need to go and actually physically help. I don't have that type of role anymore with the organizations I support. So there's no use of me being there. I would not be helpful probably. But this feeling of wanting to get out there and wanting to help, but also feeling the pull of, well, I have family and I have other responsibilities, and is it responsible to still be doing that? And everyone has to make that personal decision themselves, but it's hard being a parent. And I know I'm very grateful for the setup I have with my partner, but I also know parenting, and you're a little bit ahead of me, Andres, because your kids are, one of your kids is a bit older. I think we know it's this messy curve of things feel really stable for a while. Maybe we can lean more into work. Okay, home life needs us a little bit more right now. I need to take the pedal off with work a little bit, and having my own business allows me the flexibility to do that. And that I am very grateful for.
No, but also great as you just described it, because I mean we talked before, and they're quite young, but also you are leading by example. So I'm pretty sure they're gonna be inspired in the future, and perhaps they might carry on helping, and you're gonna leave such a legacy, right?
Oh, I hope
Because
so. Yeah.
I mean, we need to nurture that, right? I
Yeah.
mean, I was trying to do that. Like every summer, I took my kids and we do wherever we travel, we tend to do volunteer work.
Hmm.
I mean, I feel fortunate because, that we are privileged to have my kids have a really good health.
Yeah.
We are safe and sound, and
Yeah.
they growing up in a very safe place, which is not the case all around the world, right? So nurturing with the fact that, listen, the world is beyond what you see, and that things going on, I think is gonna happen, right? So
Yeah.
how do you plan to nurture that with your kids?
Oh, gosh, it's such a good question. And it's something my partner and I talk about a lot. And I talk about it with my friends here in Geneva and my friends abroad, because most of my community is not here in Geneva. How do we ensure, so I have a boy and a girl. And my ultimate goal in life is to make sure that I raise a strong little feminist boy. I want him to support women, to uphold female equity, to lean into the fact that my son is growing up, like you said, like your children, with extreme privilege, a very safe country, food on the table, shelter, access to parents who are educated and traveled and have good jobs and security. I mean, having lived around the world, Switzerland is just one of the safest places I could be, and I'm so grateful for that. But making sure that they understand their privilege and are not tortured by it either, because that's not what I want. What I want them to know is that not everyone lives the way that they live, and that leaning into community in whatever way that looks for them, they don't have to go into humanitarian work or development work or the UN or social enterprise, but leaning in whatever that looks like. They can go work in the private, my husband works in the private sector, go pure, and I mean pure private sector. Go work in the private
Right?
sector, but you can do good in other ways in your community. You can get engaged, you can get involved. That can be
Sure, sure.
physically, mentally, spiritually. And I think just letting them know that I want them to live the life where they nurture their strengths and they find their joy, but kindness at the root of everything is so important to me. And yeah, I reflect on this a lot around how we can nurture this in our children. What do you think? Do you have any hot tips? Because you're a little bit ahead of me on this.
I mean, we've been trying to do a lot of volunteer work
Yeah,
together,
yeah,
right? I used a lot of storytelling,
yeah.
and actually now we are writing some educational books for kids,
I love it. Okay.
with the stories that
Yeah,
we picked around the world, like people like you or other people that I've met in my life who doing a
yeah,
tremendous work, and they're doing it like sincerely because they want to contribute to the world. So I think it's storytelling, lead by example,
yeah,
and maybe do a little bit of volunteering,
yeah,
right?
of course.
Things like that. I think it would help, because
Yeah.
I think I mean, getting back to the community, getting back to the society is so important, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I would say it helps you to understand sometimes how lucky you are and how privileged you are. And I think
Absolutely.
solidarity,
Yeah.
reciprocity is a major topic, and
Mm-hmm.
it's gonna be in the future,
Mm-hmm.
because from my perspective, we are losing it a little bit, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
Sometimes I have the feeling like we don't appreciate anymore, like how important is solidarity, how important is help,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
And also, like, sometimes I think we just growing up in a society which over spoil us, and then we tend to forget
Mm,
how fragile life is, right? Because
yeah,
at the end of the day, look at what happened to COVID. It
yeah,
doesn't matter where you've been, who you are, everybody got affected to somehow, some point.
yeah.
Even, not only in terms of health, but
Mm.
also mentally, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it was a reckoning for a lot of people to reset their conceptual framework for their life. And it shouldn't take a global crisis to do that. All the practices that I incorporate into my coaching, but also I see, things like gratitude and slowing down and, trying to appreciate the small things in life and not just racing through our to-do lists. For me, that's really around mindful and intentional living. And of course, it's hard. It's
Mm.
hard. There are the
Yeah, of
days where you're
course.
on the back-to-back Zooms and you're making the lunches and you're sending your kids off and you're trying to get your workout in and you're doing all the things. There's this idea of, toxic positivity where you have to be positive all the time and you have to do all the things and have your protein smoothies and get your this and there's all this stuff in life that you're supposed to do. And this is where Instagram and social media comes in. And I often find myself taking a step back of, yes, I want to be grateful and I want to slow down and I want to be grateful for what I have, but also not in a toxic way. There's also, it's okay to also be wrapped up sometimes in our lives. And
Yeah.
this is where this tension of finding the balance, good days and bad days, good moments and bad moments, and trying to come back and be grounded. And that is so much easier said than done sometimes.
No, 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 I agree. I think we have so much pressure to be perfect
Yeah.
and which is not the case and is never the case. I
Mm.
think we need to allow ourselves to make mistakes. This is what
Yeah.
I do with my kids. I mean,
Yeah.
if I do something that I should have done it, I would say, listen, I'm sorry, though.
Yeah.
I was stressed out. I should have I should have taken these out of you.
Yeah.
Sometimes daddy gets angry and stressed
Yeah.
out, but it's nothing personal. And
Yeah.
also I don't want them to have this kind of guilt trip. You see what I'm saying? I don't
Hmm.
want them to feel bad because they are privileged, okay?
No. No.
Because it just happened.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
matter of luck
Yeah.
or destiny, whatever you want to call it. He
Yeah.
just say, listen, don't feel guilt about it, but if you have a superpower, which could be like this,
Use it.
just share it and use it. It's fine. If you want
Absolutely.
to do it though, you know?
Yeah. And Andres, you mentioned something a minute ago, and I guess more now we're getting more into parenting talk, but what you were talking about is repair, because even as parents, we're not perfect. And there's a fantastic TED talk on this, Dr. Becky. She has this entire parenting program. She's from the US, she's a psychologist, and she has a TED
I know
talk.
her.
Yeah, and it's on repairing with your kids, just like you would with a colleague or a partner or a friend. And it's an important concept that I hadn't heard of until I became a parent, and I really believe in it because we do make mistakes. It's hard.
Yeah, I know Dr. Becky. I also follow her.
Yeah.
So she gives such a good like
Right?
tips and everything. Yeah, no, but it's true. Listen, eight, right? Help and aid. So
Yeah.
this is a huge topic nowadays,
Yeah.
like cuts in terms of aid and
Yeah.
help and so
Yeah.
on. Now USAID cuts have created a major shift in the development landscape, right?
Yep.
What do you see as the key consequences for
Mm,
NGOs and
mm.
social enterprises and sustainable enterprises
Yeah.
that have relied on USAID funding for years?
Yeah.
Because one of the things that I loved about this topic, and I came across with a great post that you shared on LinkedIn, and that's
Okay.
why, oh wow, she's speaking to me because,
Good. I'm
okay,
glad.
no, but it's fantastic because you were talking about opportunities,
Okay.
right? Which I think, as you said before, is a good way to see it from a positive side.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
what's your take on it?
Well, first, I'm glad that some of my LinkedIn content resonated. Sometimes you feel like you're speaking out into the ether there, but I really try to provide value and talk about the topics that I think are relevant and current. And I've been talking a lot about the sector lately. What does it mean for NGOs and international organizations and humanitarian aid? But what does it mean for those individuals who work for those organizations? And what does it mean for the communities that we're out there supporting? And you mentioned the USAID cuts, but it's not just USAID now. So that was the first, but now we've seen cuts from the UK and the Dutch, and across Europe, we're going to see even more. And people keep talking about Yeah, so there are a few things I would say. The first is people keep talking about filling the gap. How are we going to fill the gap? How are we going to fill the gap? We're not going to fill the gap. We're not going back. There is no more gap. The entire structure has shifted. The entire architecture of international development and the way that we provide support is going to have to shift. And yes, we can lament a system that is now being dismantled. And we can take a minute to do that, and we can be sad and we can grieve, particularly for those who have lost their careers, but we can also look at it as an opportunity to rebuild and build back better. This system was broken. I mean, when you think about humanitarian aid, we spent the last decade talking about the grand bargain and how we were going to fix it. And, people talk about how, there's too much invested in foreign aid and there's dependencies and localization. We need to give more power and equity to local communities. But we've been having the same conversations. I mean, I've been in this sector almost 20 years. Every couple of years, another thread is pulled where they're like, we should be doing this. And it's like, well, I'm pretty sure we've been talking about this. So there's devastation across the sector. And I see it with my clients and my colleagues and the peers that I work with. And we're going to all try to support each other in getting through this. But we need to look at it as an opportunity for innovation, for the architecture to change in a way that we wouldn't have unless there had been this devastation. And this is certainly the biggest shift that I've seen in my career in the 2 decades. But coming back to your original question, how are NGOs going to adapt? A few things. So one, we have to be very careful because trust is going to be broken between donors and implementers and the communities we serve. So the communities aren't going to understand why their rations in Cox's Bazar are cut in the refugee camps. Communities who have been getting their ART for their HIV treatments or their antiretroviral drugs aren't going to understand, well, all of a sudden why that clinic had to close. They don't understand the politics that are happening potentially in the US. And this isn't they can't understand. It's that maybe no one's taking the opportunity to even explain what's happening. So trust is going to be broken all along the aid continuum. And we have to be very careful of that, which has been built over years and years. That being said, some organizations are going to pivot in really profound ways. They're going to change their funding models where they've been reliant on bilateral and multilateral aid for a long time. Maybe they'll pivot into more local resource mobilization and crowdfunding and support, getting support from their local communities. Governments are going to step in. Philanthropy will step in. I mean, there's all these shifting funding models and even the aid models themselves, blended finance, things will come up. And already we've seen certain donors stepping up, trying to fill the gap a little bit. But what I believe we will see moving forward is some NGOs and organizations will close. Some of them will merge, which quite frankly is not a terrible idea. There's a lot of competition in the sector. There's a lot of repetition and duplication and things like that. And I think what we'll see at some point is even larger organizations. There's even talk, and we've talked about this for years, should some UN agencies be merging? Do we need to have procurement and HR and logistics departments in every of the dozens of UN agencies that exist? Should some of these be merging? All this has been talked about for years. So those are just some of the trends that I see happening moving forward.
Yeah. And also I think it's a great opportunity to get back the voice to those who've been working in the sector for a long time. Because, my feeling is, sometimes politics just overtake everything, They talk about everything, they appropriate everything, for a matter of, voting or for politics, for the sake of politics, for the sake to have more voters and so on their side. So I think it's great because now, we can see how community are gonna basically face these kind of cuts, right?
Yeah.
The best example for me, like more recently, it was the UK. In 2008, during the economic crunch, the UK government were like, okay, there is no more money. We're gonna start to cut all the funding. So the charities, the NGO, basically the third sector has to be transformed. So basically they start to like legalize or formalize the social enterprise concept, right?
Yeah.
So they were basically providing help and professionalize the sector in order to be a little bit more self-sustainable.
Yeah.
Throughout the process, I mean, as you said before, some of them merged, some of them closed down, some of them survived, some of them born, because that is true. But before COVID, there was this Social Enterprise UK report, and basically they revealed that 3% of the GDP of the UK, it was provided by the social enterprise sector. So what I'm trying to say is like, okay, it's not the end of the world.
Yeah.
So let's move forward.
Yeah.
Just focusing on what opportunities, as you put it,
Yeah.
how we can move forward. So that would be like a global coaching scheme where you have to like leaving behind your fears and
Baggage,
traumas and
ways of
package
working, all of
and
it. Yeah.
find a clarity and then
Yeah.
just see
But
how we can
but here's
be.
the thing. Like I said earlier, people's identity is so tied to their work. And I have never seen more patriotism than I have in the aid sector, where people will fight to the death for their organization, for every penny, for every activity. And you always talk about rationalization of aid and prioritization. You know, I've worked in camps and I've worked in places where organizations are fighting for every penny, and we lose that at the center of this are humans and communities that need our support, right? So when we talk about, organizations potentially merging, what that ultimately means is you go from departments that have 10 to have 5, and that means people will be out of work. And these are humans that have dedicated their lives to these sectors. So we have to look at it from lots of different angles, how this is changing people's livelihoods, how it's changing the services we're providing. But ultimately, at the core of everything is how can we do it? How can we prioritize those most in need and those communities most in need with the resources we have, while centering everything around humanity, not just for the people we're serving, but the people who are doing the work. And ultimately, people have a hard time changing. Change is hard. If change was that easy, coaches and therapists and all these service providers wouldn't exist. People are going to have to be open around where their strengths are, where their weaknesses are, where their organizations need to move into the future, and try some really big, bold new ways of working. Even before this devastation across the sector happened, the humanitarian sector did not have enough funding to even meet the needs it needed to meet, and now we have even less. So people are going to have to get creative and comfortable with a lot of discomfort.
So Kelsey, listen, because you have such a good experience in coaching and
Mm,
working on social impact.
mm,
So what would you say to the
mm.
individual who
Yep,
work in the sector and
yep,
now is trembling because he might lose the jobs?
yeah,
And on the other hand, at organizational level,
yeah,
what would you say to these directors who have to deal with these cuts and
yeah,
then they need to find a way to find money
yeah,
to keep at least their,
yeah,
social capital
yeah.
on and start to and keep delivering value, no social
Yeah.
value. So what
And I
would you
am
say?
speaking to those individuals. I mean, they're my clients, both the organizations and the individuals. So let's start with the organizations. If I was speaking to a leadership team right now who has either had their funding cut or they think their funding is going to get cut, the first thing I would immediately do is I would tell them to take a breath. It sounds so potentially silly, but there's a lot of panic out there, and we
Yeah.
need to stop and take a breath. And then I would tell them to take stock. Where is their organization with their strategy and their finances? Before we start cutting, before we start moving, we reprioritizing, contacting grantees, how much money do you have to sustain? And unfortunately, a lot of organizations, local organizations and NGOs, they don't have a lot of bandwidth. They don't have a lot of roadmap there in terms of like to cover 6 months or a year of salaries if USAID isn't paying back owed what they already owed, for the Q1 of this year and Q4 of last year. A lot of organizations just have to close their doors right away. So what I would say is take a breath, gather your information, know your data, your workforce, your programs, how much do you need to keep operating? And then you start looking at your prioritization. You start looking at the needs of the communities you're serving. What do you actually tangibly need to run those? Where can you cut? There's an article that was posted on LinkedIn a couple weeks ago. It was talking about the small C cuts, not the big cuts like human workforce and programs, small C cuts, little things, like travel and this and that, whatever. We all have superfluous stuff around our organizations that can be cut. But don't just go start laying off people right from the get-go, because psychological safety, there's nothing more important than that as a leader in an organization. And if you start doing layoffs without having all the information and communicating it properly, you're not going to have anyone there who feels safe enough to even continue to run the programs that you need to keep running. So communication, like resilience, know that this storm too shall pass, but also allow yourself to think about what is possible if the entire system were to break down overnight, because in some ways that's what's happening. Should
Hmm.
you be talking to other organizations around pooling your resources? Should you be talking to new investors or no new donors? Should you be looking outside of the multilateral aid sector, going to philanthropy if you've never done it. Look at crowdsourcing funding, looking at revenue generating models, blended finance. Start to invest time and resources and letting yourself think about things you never normally had, because the old ways of working don't exist. So that's what I would say to organizations.
That's great. And to individuals?
I would also first start with take a breath.
Okay.
I can tell you, honestly, Andres, that one day, a couple weeks ago, I spoke to 18 people over the course of 24 hours that had been laid off. Friends, colleagues, clients, Slacks, WhatsApp, emails, phone calls, people in my community around the world. It was like 16 or 18 people that had all lost their jobs. If you're in an organization, and there are organizations out there, big UN agencies and NGOs that are laying off thousands of people, organizations that are just absolutely closing overnight. A lot of service providers in the US, some of the middle ground, kind of like grant makers, the implementers. I would tell people to take a breath. If you still have your job, or even if you've been laid off, the next step is also a similar one that I tell the organizations, is to look at getting your finances in order. How long can you sustain yourself if you don't have a paycheck coming, or if you were to lose your next paycheck? Because before we start doing anything around job search or reflection, you need to know where you are. And the next question is, how long can you go? And are you looking for a job, or are you looking for the job? Those are two different things. If you are in the US and you work for USAID and you just lost your job, and there's 150,000 people that are also on the market looking for jobs, the market is very, very tough. And so what's going to happen is you need to say, what am I willing to do to pay my mortgage so I don't lose my house? These are all very practical realities that people are facing.
Of course.
Maybe you need to find a job, gig economy, or something short term. Maybe you need to move into consulting. Or are you looking for the job? And then we start doing the reflections around, what's your ikigai? What brings you joy? Your career inventory. What are your superpowers? What are your strengths? Then we start mapping your network. Who do you have out there in your court? Who are your allies? Where can you get that dream job? But also, what are some potential jobs in the meantime that can help bring in a source of revenue? And I have this framework. It's called the Career Reset Framework. And it's a list of, 10 steps that people can walk through systematically. And some of them are macro level, thinking about where you want to be in the system of impact. What is impact for you? How important is purpose for you? And other things are really practical, like get your CV in order, update your LinkedIn. And of course, people know how to do those steps, but sometimes you get so lost in the chaos and the panic that you forget. Start first things first, take a breath, get your finances in order, and let's think about what you need next, rather than just panic applying to 100 jobs right away.
Fantastic. Can you elaborate a little bit about this framework? This is something that you created?
Yeah. I mean, I can send it to you. It's on my website, and you can link it in the show notes or whatever.
I'm pretty sure our community would appreciate
They
to
can get
hear.
it. It's for free from my website. Yeah. So it just basically outlines those 10 steps that I sort of alluded to a few minutes ago. So the first one is take a breath, get your finances in order, look at what brings you joy, your purpose, like what kind of work do you actually want to do? Allow yourself the time and the space to reflect. Like, do I want to stay in social impact? Do I want to leave? Am I open to doing new things? Looking at your network. Then we're going to start looking at your tools, your CVs, your LinkedIn, internal and external resources. When people start thinking about networking, they start to panic. Networking doesn't have to be this awkward, uncomfortable thing. It doesn't always have to be icky. It doesn't have to be transactional. I always tell people to start giving before you get. So before you start asking people on LinkedIn for things, form genuine human connections. Reach out to the people that you know, build those relationships. They might not help you tomorrow, but they might help you in 6 months when a job does come up that you do want. Lean into community, lean into other job seekers. There are other people in the market right now who are also looking for work. Find your community of people to support you. And that might be your partner or your colleagues or your friends, or it might be a job search committee or an online community where you can get access to other support. And I think that's one of the things I've been doing in this crisis, is you've probably seen it, like posting on LinkedIn resources. You're an organization and you're looking for fundraising. Here are these communities. You're a job seeker. Here are some free resources. You're an employer and you don't even know how to help your staff. Here's some leadership tips. So myself and the entire social impact community, we're all leaning in to try to do our best to support everyone right now, because the sector really is struggling.
Yeah, it is indeed.
Yeah.
So, given your extensive experience working with major donors,
Yeah.
what role do you think can leadership and resilience could play in guiding such organizations through
Yeah.
financial uncertainty like the one
Yeah.
that we are living now.
Yeah. And then I think one of these things is, what is resilience actually? Like, what does that word even mean? And also the word leadership. I think people get really tripped up in a crisis like this. They look to their leadership, but actually, leadership is more than just a job title. You might not have a C-suite or a director role, but you can have leadership qualities across your organization, even if you might not have that influence that you might have with the title or the salary or the team. And so I always say to people, lean in and support your community, whether you're early in your career, middle of your career, or you're an actual leader. But to me, resilience is the ability to weather the storm and support your immediate community in a way that is transparent and communicative and bringing people peace of mind, even if you don't have all the answers.
Mhm.
And this day and age, everyone talks about authentic leadership. It's also one of these buzzwords where I'm like, what does that even mean? It's like, are you authentic leadership? Are you going to act the same way you do at home with like your family and your children when you're in front of a town hall with like 100,000 staff? Like, is that authentic? No, we all have our personas. You mentioned it earlier on, the way we are putting ourselves out there in the world. You're not going to be the exact same human in every single scenario. But I
Yeah.
think what leaders can do right now is identify your core values that you want to bring to the workplace during this crisis. And they might be a little bit different than how you were leading outside of a crisis. You might have been looking at scale, you might have been looking at, other types of things for your organization, but now you're looking at leading through this storm. Identify the core values. Is it transparency? Is it psychological safety? Is it innovation? And pick those, lead with them, and communicate with your teams to say, we can't focus on everything right now. This is what we're going to focus on. And the last thing I would say is just listening. I have been with organizations that have gone through transformations and reorganizations. I've been part of a leadership team before that was going through layoffs and restructuring. We made so many mistakes. Nobody's perfect. Try to put yourself in everyone's shoes. So I've talked to individuals right now that are getting laid off from their jobs and they're lambasting their leadership. I talk to the leadership teams who are saying, people are, not acting in a way that is befitting, international civil servant. Everyone is kind of yelling at one another that nobody is behaving. The donors are upset with, some of the other donors. The philanthropists are upset that they're being called out for not giving enough funding to fill the gap. People are upset. Let's try to show some empathy and put ourselves in everyone else's shoes. No one got into this sector for malicious reasons. We all got in here to do good and to help and for social justice and social impact. And let's try to remember that and keep that at the core of everything we're doing.
Mm. Amazing. Could you maybe like share an example where maybe you've seen organizations or perhaps leaders
Yeah.
successfully build resilience and maintain their impact despite shifting funding models?
Yeah. I have a few I could think of, but one you might actually know of because it is like very social entrepreneurial. Have you ever heard of Living Goods out of East Africa?
No.
So Living Goods, and actually their CEO, I met her years ago. She's actually a friend of mine, and she just retired or she just left. Her name was Liz Jarman. So she took over Living Goods maybe like a decade ago. And it was an organization that was based in East Africa that used community health workers that were going door to door to able to boost global health, like public health promotion. They were providing public health messaging, but they were also selling goods. So they were equipping them with these like goods. They could have been selling, health products or sanitary products or food and nutrition products, and it was giving them a livelihood. So this was a social entrepreneur type organization. And after a few years, the donor cycle, you need funding to buy the products, to subsidize them for the CHWs, and you're creating this entire health delivery model in parallel to the government system. So how sustainable is this if we're going to continually need government investment? And after a few years, Liz and the team over there realized that this was not entirely sustainable. They completely pivoted their entire model. Rather than being grant-based and to subsidize these CHWs, instead they started partnering with the government to pay living wages to the community health workers instead of paying for the products themselves. And Liz, if you're listening, or anyone who works for Living Goods, they could probably explain this model way better than I could. But they completely pivoted to a much more sustainable model. And now across East and West Africa, they partner with governments to help cover the wages and the training and the advocacy. And the entire model shifted. They shifted their funding model, they shifted their implementation model. And honestly, because I've worked in global health for so long, I think this is one of the best examples of an organization that really looked at what they were doing and it wasn't sustainable. They pivoted, and they have data and evidence and evaluations to show that having those hard conversations and doing the hard things pays off in the long run for the communities and for the organizations.
Yeah. Well, that's a great example. Thanks for that. So talking about the global south, right?
Yeah.
Because they are the ones who I suppose are gonna get more affected, or the impact is gonna be a little bit bigger than in other societies. They have a better ecosystem, they have different ways, the job market is a little bit bigger, you know. So how would you think they're gonna basically like navigate these challenges? Because you know there's a plethora of literature in terms, especially that because you worked in the sub-Saharan African, the level of dependency, right? For many years they depended on funding and so on. So what do you think they're gonna face this new challenge?
They're going to adapt. They're resilient. These organizations, these individuals have had these organizations come in for decades, telling them what they need, telling them how they're going to spend the resources they're getting for them. You know, we all talked about localization for the last couple decades. Have we really seen the power inequities shift? Sometimes, yes. And there are some organizations that do a phenomenal examples of participatory grant making and making sure that the community's voices are centered. I mean, I don't know if you've heard of like Frida, the Young Feminist Fund. Their participatory grant making model, or Global Fund for Children, Haley Ruffy, she's one of their co-CEOs. They have leaned into participatory grant making in ways that are just best case scenarios across the sector. But not every organization has done that. And so what I see happening is these local organizations are going to have more power. They're going to have more say. These individuals are going to have the opportunity to step up into these roles that maybe traditionally have been held by internationals or quote unquote expats. But also where I really see the sector changing is all these middle guys, these big institutional guys that were holding all this power, all this money. And the organizations, I mean, I'm not sure if I should name them. Don't anybody like come out and troll me for naming them online, but you know, like the Chemonics and Management Sciences for Health and all these big institutions, when you look at the spreadsheets of the USAID contractors that have lost funding, and you look at the millions and sometimes billions of dollars that were going to these large organizations to then grant make or pass along these funds down the chain, and all the money that was in the process, we're going to get leaner, and hopefully that funding ends up in the hands of the actual implementers doing the work.
Yeah.
That would be the best case scenario for everybody.
Sure, sure. You talk about innovation, right? But you know how hard it is to innovate.
I know, it's a
That-
buzzword.
I know. So how would you
Yeah.
maybe like advise
Hmm.
those who now are struggling
Yeah.
to at least create an innovative ecosystem or encourage those who work for them to
Yeah.
innovate?
Well, there's two things there. One is innovating within your organization, and the other is innovating in the ecosystem. And innovation in the ecosystem, there are organizations and sectors and convenience where we talk about that. I mean, the Skoll World Forum that just happened in Oxford last week. Not everyone has access to forums like that, like Davos and UNGA and all these things. But that is one global gathering where you have beautiful communities in the room, actual communities of people doing change, and they talk about innovation all the time. So even if you can't fly off to Oxford you can join online. They do great stuff and great conversations. And so I think talking about innovation at an ecosystem level, that's when organizations have to talk to each other. Right now, people are panicking, they're getting their budgets in order, they're doing their layoffs, but eventually organizations will be coming together, I think, and they already have, to look at how can we help each other out, whether that's merging or, you know, looking at prioritization of resources and participatory grant making models where communities come together and say, oh no, I don't need these funds, you need those funds. And there are organizations that do that. The Equality Fund in Canada does that incredibly well as well. But then we're talking about innovation in your organization itself. That's where you have a little more control. But you have to get your leadership team in order. You have to get your board to agree. Not all boards of nonprofits are okay with the same level of risk, but if you were ever going to take a risk, now is the time to do it. And that might be in your funding model, might be in the way you're dispersing your funds, it might be in the way your organization is structured. Now might be the time to restructure in a way where you can do some cost savings. But these are big conversations that might have to happen in a short period of time. So not being scared of trying something new right now, if you were ever going to try something new, now would be the time.
Yeah. So would you say now for organizations would be useful to use Ikigai?
Oh,
No, the Japanese concept.
I want everyone to use Ikigai all the time. Whether or not your
But
leaders believe in it is another question, but it doesn't have to be Ikigai as a tool or sweet spot exercise or, whatnot. But sitting down and listening to your team, listening to the people that have been doing the work, talking to the communities where you're actually implementing the programs, I mean, now's the time. If ever there was a time to build back up, it's now. But also allowing yourself to get out of your computer where you're looking at the spreadsheets with your CFO and your accountants, trying to figure out how are you going to pay salaries next month. I get it. I have been a leader before where, you're looking at the bank accounts, you're like, how am I going to pay salaries? So I
mm,
get the pressure. I'm not negating how hard this is for leaders, but ensuring that they have the space and the time to have those conversations, to try to think and brainstorm and look at other ways. Maybe it's revenue models or whatnot, but you got to start somewhere, right?
yeah, of course, move forward,
Yeah,
is so important nowadays.
yeah.
You talk about trust.
Mm,
So based upon your knowledge and your experience, why trust is maybe going away?
mm,
What's wrong with people? What happened, with trust? What do you think is kind of this trust
mm,
crisis in terms of trust and
mm.
solidarity? What do you think about it?
I mean, do we think trust is going away or do we think we're looking at it in a different way? I don't know. I mean, if you think about people talk about communities and how we used to live, hunter-gatherer societies, and how our immediate reaction was we had these tight-knit communities, and when you encountered another community, the first reaction was, aggression, until we built trust, and then you trusted others and you let them in. We are becoming such an individualistic society, particularly in North America, where I'm from, maybe a little less in Europe and maybe a little less on the African continent. But I don't know that trust is eroding necessarily. It's that maybe we are taking longer to build up trust to begin with. This
Hmm.
individual society, and whether that's you as an organization, the social impact sector, or you, your individual community, before you let someone in, before you share the resources, maybe it's just taking us a little bit longer to build those unions and build those communities than before, if we weren't on social media and living in this individualistic way. But for these organizations, these NGOs, that we've really created this ecosystem and this architecture where organizations are competing for funding rather than coming together, finding the solutions for the community, and then deciding who gets the funding. And that's what participatory grant making is as well. And so some of these organizations that I mentioned, like the Equality Fund in Canada that does this, they, with the community, identify the needs, the organizations come together and they choose who gets the funding. Now, this sounds like a utopia. It's very hard to manage. It's very costly to manage, and it can take a lot longer than just having like an expert committee decide, in a very hierarchical way who gets funding from what pots of money. So there are pros and cons to each, but coming back to trust, I don't know that trust is eroding these days, but when you have things like the stop work orders happening in the US where services are cut off like that, of course communities are not going to trust those organizations anymore. And that's where I'm mostly concerned, because organizations are not going to just start back up again. They're going to have to rebuild that trust again. And that is going to be really challenging.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, one of the problem is like people definitely don't trust institutions,
Mm,
okay? And in a way, there is this global discourse about how funds have been misused, right?
yeah.
In the third sector and so on. So I
Mm,
think it's going to be a little bit of challenging. It's going to be
mm,
challenging for NGOs, foundations, and charities
mm.
to build up or rebuild trust to their donors and funders, or even possible people who want to contribute, right?
Yeah.
So how would you say to them? Because
Mm,
my concern about these cuts, more than the actual execution of funding cuts, is the
mm,
fact of the labeling. Okay.
mm,
When we talk about, there is a concept in sociology which is called label theory,
mhm,
that you just put a label. And now I was thinking, wow, society is getting that, like, giving is
mm.
bad because it's being misused. So I was
Yeah.
thinking, how would you advise your clients or people
Mm,
in the sector to
mm,
tackle this?
mm.
Because this is a major crisis.
Yeah.
because my advice is like, oh, we don't trust these institutions. Why? Because they misuse it. Or maybe they weren't actually like giving away to the people who are in need, which is not the case
Yeah,
across the globe, right? I mean, there were some good in this kind of aid. So what would
of
you
course.
maybe, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, I could go in so many directions on this, but I mean, particularly out of the US, some of the rhetoric has been, oh, there was misuse and misappropriation of funding. That's why we are closing USAID. We're creating something leaner and more strategic. And we know that there was a lot of, there was politics involved there. There was a lot of misinformation. Having
Mm-hmm.
worked for and having been the recipient and worked with USAID contractors and been the recipient of USAID funds, there were many, many life-saving programs happening around the globe with aid funds. There's no doubt about it. Lives are being saved every single day. Was there misappropriation of funds or potentially programs or waste, or you could have cut the fat? Sure, of course. Every organization has that, whether you're private sector or public sector or third sector or whatnot. This idea that to label an entire sector is, quite frankly, unproductive. It's not a good use of the conversation. And the people that are saying, oh, why would I, like, if now you're talking about in terms of philanthropy. So there's a lot of work done around the psychology of philanthropy and the psychology of giving, whether you're an individual giving $5 or a philanthropist giving, 100 times that. The idea is that understanding why people are giving to begin with, looking at what is the rationale. And so if I was an organization trying to gain trust with my donors, there's a lot written around stewardship, around how do you get access to new donors, how do you build trust, how do you steward, and a lot of that is around authentic relationships, not transactional. So you go to the community and you talk about your work, you tell story, you provide data, you show your impact, but you also show the narratives behind it. So there's a really incredible person named Kevin Brown, and he just released a book last week, actually, and he talks about being fundable and findable. So he always talks about the same messages, like organizations, people need to be able to find you, and they need to understand what the heck you do in a clear, concise way. If you can communicate your impact through data and through storytelling, and you can be authentic with your donors, start relationships. Don't go to them and say, I need money for this. Find out what they're into. Find out the psychology of their giving. Why are they giving? Why do they want to engage? And build those relationships over time. That's where trust comes in. And that's where partnerships and multi-year giving comes in. But when people are in crisis and scarcity mode right now, with their funding being cut off, they don't have time to do that. But I would really caution people against going for the short-term win right now. You need to be investing in the short-term strategies and the long-term ones.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is an opportunity for our sector to prove what we are made of,
Yeah, absolutely.
and
Yeah.
obviously like prove resilience, because this is also another word which is overused sometimes. Okay,
Yeah.
our sector is resilient and so on, but sometimes we need to prove it.
Mm,
I don't know, it's good. I mean, let's see what happens, but I think it seems like an opportunity to move
yeah,
forward.
I agree.
I want to talk about the SDGs and the Agenda 2030, right?
Mhm.
You worked in the UN, so I suppose you are very familiar with the agenda and so
Yeah,
on.
yeah,
Um, the Agenda 2030 have been central to driving global sustainability and, of course, development, right?
mhm,
How do you think these frameworks are influencing the
mm,
way donors and social or sustainable enterprises
mm,
approach
mm,
topics such as climate change
mm.
and sustainable development in the wake of USA cuts?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the SDGs are a North Star. They're these ambitious goals that we're meant to get to by 2030, which is also wild because when we first started talking about the SDGs, it felt so far away, and now it's around the corner, and quite a few of them we haven't met, and we're not on track. And we know
Mhm.
that, and we knew from the beginning that we were not going to be on track to meet them. Some of the health targets are just incredible, and the climate ones and whatnot. I believe in the wake of these cuts, people might have the tendency to use these funding cuts as an excuse for not reaching the SDGs. But the reality is, a lot of these targets were not on track even before this funding crisis. 5 years in the grand scale and scope of what we were trying to do is a drop in the bucket. And the reality is, we just need to be honest. Let's be honest about where we're on track, where we're not, and what do we need to do differently next time. and I do believe multilateral funders, bilateral funders, they use the SDGs in that framework. I would say philanthropies are maybe beating to the beat of their own drum a little bit more. That might be a framework they lean into, and it might not be because they don't see themselves within that space. Philanthropy is very different. It comes down to legacy and heritage and family and personal ambitions more so necessarily than fitting into a framework like bilateral funding agencies have to with governments. So yeah, I guess that's my 2 cents. Sorry, Andres, it wasn't super clear, but it's the
No, it's
SDGs are this
fine.
huge framework, which I think are not as present in everyone's everyday life anymore as they were when they were first launched, to be honest.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it's very interesting to see different approaches to it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, as a framework, it worked, but I suppose, execute them, make it happen. It's contextual, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it depends on the country that you
Yeah.
are. You've been to Somalia.
Mm.
Somalia was considered from 1992 until 2005 or 2007 as a stateless country.
Mm.
So, if you don't have an infrastructure or if you have the means, it's really hard to put this into action, right?
Yeah. And also, we all need a framework. People need to be working towards a North Star, a common approach. But then when people deviate from it, what reprimand is there? What I love the idea of philanthropy and I love working in philanthropy after I'd been in this more strict UN system for a long time because there was so many more options. You could like be creative or be innovative or fail, break things and move on, kind of thing with philanthropy because it wasn't necessarily taxpayer dollars. Okay, there's a lot against philanthropy as well because a lot of the wealth has been accrued in other ways, devastation to certain communities and whatnot. But I just don't see philanthropy leaning in as hard to this SDG framework as I do other parts of the ecosystem. And let's see what happens in a few years and what's going to come next.
Yeah. No, it's true. I mean, I was actually connected with your framework. I
Hmm.
mean, it's good that you have a framework,
Hmm.
but it does really depends on how do you use it
For
and how
sure.
do you implement it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, of
But
course.
it's good to have a guide or an infrastructure to go through
Yeah,
and see, and based on, and then you elaborate to this.
absolutely.
I want to talk about the future, okay, of
Sure.
social impact, advisory, and philanthropy.
Hmm.
What do you think the future holds for philanthropy
Yeah.
and perhaps CSR in a world where
Yeah.
traditional donors like USAID are
Hmm.
scaling back?
Yeah.
And how can businesses, governments, and the third sector really better
Yeah.
collaborate to fill the funding gaps?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's an opportunity. In the first days after some of these stop work orders were happening, I felt there was a sense online of where are the philanthropists? Where are the philanthropists? Why are they not jumping in and filling the gap? Why are they not, with their voices, their advocacy, their resources stepping in? Now I see that the rhetoric or sort of the discussion has changed where they're like, oh no, they're stepping up, they're stepping up. They were getting their bearings, they were collaborating, they're increasing their endowment payouts, all these things. There's all these trends online and on LinkedIn and whatnot. I see this as such an opportunity. I think this is an opportunity for new donor collaboratives, new ways of working, less reliance on an old colonial system that had baked into it huge inequalities and inefficiencies. So I think there's tons of opportunity. I think the one thing to remember though is we can't expect philanthropy to fill the entire gap. We're going to have to look at different blended models of financing. And organizations also need to know that it takes time for people to trust each other, just like we were talking about before, right? But I do see certain trends already playing out. You look at the giving trends of people like Mackenzie Scott, longer term grants covering fixed funding, very little reporting requirements. Philanthropy is moving in that direction of like big bet philanthropy and trust-based philanthropy and just trusting that the organizations know how to do the work, give them the funding and let them get on with it. And
Hmm.
not so much the sort of multilateral aid funding mechanism of we're only going to pay for certain things because this aligns with our foreign aid priority or for international priorities. And, there's tons of reporting requirements and it's going to be a labor intensive relationship built on a little bit of distrust. I think the sector is moving for the better, but nothing changes overnight either. People also need to be patient.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
So, you seem to be a very positive person, right? So how do you see the future, the near future,
Yeah.
or the immediate future?
Yeah.
Is it going to be positive? Is going to be
Yeah.
a little bit dull?
Yeah.
Then we're going to go through such
Yeah.
a transition and then it's going to get
Yeah.
better? What's your feeling?
Depends. Who are you in the ecosystem? For the 150,000 people globally, I'm tracking this data based on the Stop Aid tracker online. It says 150,000 confirmed jobs have been lost globally. I think it was like 60 or 70,000 in the US at this point. Don't quote me on
Yeah.
those numbers, but that's the ballpark. For the 150,000 people globally who have lost their jobs right now, the situation feels awful. It feels bleak. And I'm working with a lot of them and, on a lot of panels and supporting a lot of work with these people in these communities. It's hard for them right now. For people who still have their jobs, the psychological safety of the environments, of the context within their working, it's overwhelming. A lot of the workforce has left. They have more work to do. They're worried they're not going to have a job in a 6 months or 6 days, 6 years. So there's a lot of worry. And I think we have to embrace that. We have to have empathy for what the livelihood effects are. Then we have the communities, the services that have stopped. This is bleak. I am a positive person, and I do think we're all going to do our best in this immediate aftermath. But now that we're not so much in the acute phase, we're sort of going to the middle ground. Like the panic is there. We've recovered. We've taken a deep breath. We've gotten our finances in order for the organizations and the individuals, and now we're stepping forward. I think there's opportunity there for collaboration. There's new ways of working, and I see initiatives kicking off right now that I have so much hope in. So things like the UN Reform Charter. It's being led by somebody named Heba Ali. She's the former CEO of the New Humanitarian, which was the journalistic agency that really reported on humanitarian work. And she's leading this initiative for an entire UN reform, which honestly, if you'd asked me 6 months ago, I didn't know much about it until recently. I would have said, oh, this is gonna be really hard to change the structure of the UN. Now with everything that's happening, I think we have a really good shot at it. So there's initiatives like that. We have initiatives in the US where, there's a lot of political will to change things like lack of transparency around foundations, donor advised funds, DAFs. We haven't even talked about that, but at one point in the US last year, I think it was 1 to 4, where 4 times the amount of donations were going into donor advised funds than were going into actual charities and philanthropies. And if you know anything about donor advised funds, you know that people get the tax break as soon as they put their money in there, but hundreds of millions, potentially billions of dollars are sitting in DAFs that haven't been deployed to charities. So it's a huge problem for the sector, right? There's money sitting there that could be going to good use. And so we're starting to see a lot of movement in the sector to redefine what are DAFs in different countries. So we have the UN Reform Charter, we have the DAFs, we have big philanthropies that met last week at school saying, we're increasing our endowment. The MacArthur Foundation increased their endowment. We're not talking about a few million, we're talking about hundreds of millions more of dollars that are going to be dispersed every year. So there are these initiatives, there are these trends that are happening. At the micro level, it's hard not to be sad and scared and terrified when you see programs closing, people losing their jobs, rations going down in camps. But people are hopeful that this will be the beginning of a new architecture for international development and humanitarian work, and I'm hopeful.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah.
And the last question, Kelsi, maybe if someone is super lost,
Yeah.
he doesn't know where to start,
Yeah.
would you be able to recommend maybe a book or maybe a video or
Oh,
some literature or documentary, I don't know,
yeah.
to start with and maybe get
Yeah.
inspired
Yeah.
and help them to this ikigai thing
Yeah.
or maybe to take a breath because
My first response is always take a breath. You probably know this now, Andres.
yeah, of course.
Take a breath, take a deep breath, go out for a walk. Everything feels better after we've gotten a breath of fresh air. But yeah, then let's get to work, man. There's so many resources out there. I mean, the first thing I would say is take a breath and find your community. Find your community to talk to. There are job search communities online. There are new initiatives popping up around fundraising. I just posted about this on LinkedIn a couple days ago. There's a few organizations that are collectives that can help individuals with fundraising, like Connective Impact is one of them. Black Fox Philanthropy is one institution. Different price points, obviously. There's EC Fundraising Hub that is coming up in Geneva. That's a collective membership that's going to help organizations with their fundraising at a more affordable price point. So there's things like that. There's job search communities like YN Vota has the Career Pivot Online. It's a free online community for those that have lost their jobs. It has a Substack. I spoke on a webinar of his last week. There are coaching programs. You can go to my website. I have lots of free resources at kriitmaa.com where you can download But in terms of books, I mean, where to be inspired, there's some really good TED Talks out there. What is it? Is it Ted Piota, who has that really famous TED Talk about the charity sector? I think it's Ted Piota, that's his name is, and it's just amazing. So Tim Piota. And podcasts. Oh my gosh. So I love the podcast, What Do Donors Want? It's by IG Advisors, a social impact consulting firm out of the UK. I also really love the podcast, True Humanitarian. It's with humanitarian experts across the sector, and every week they're kind of unpacking and dissecting what these changes are. And then honestly, if you just want to have a little fun, because you know what, we can listen to these like policy and educational podcasts, whatnot. My favorite podcast right now is the Trevor Noah podcast. It's called What Now? And every week he has such a diversity of people. I mean, he could have like the mayor of LA, and then he could have Halle Berry, and they talk about politics and culture and religion and diversity and really hard topics. But it's funny and it can be light and it can be heavy, and I learn so much every week. And it's not about social impact, but I think a lot of the frameworks for life that he talks about can be applied to our social impact sector too.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
And it's also good to be a little bit out of our bubble, right?
Of
To
course.
cherry pick some ideas,
Yeah.
to bring it about and to implement them,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Getting outside, there's a lot of data to show that people who are happiest at work are those who have a plethora of hobbies outside of work.
Yeah.
Back to one of the biggest challenges I see with my clients, just like having an identity that is outside of your work, enjoying your
Yes.
family, your hobbies, your health, your wellness, your sports. Get out there and do other stuff, because the sector is in crisis and it can feel really heavy right now.
Yeah, actually, like to close up this conversation, is perfect what we will start with, what we were talking about, your process and coaching and the struggle of people who don't have the capacity to separate themselves
Mm,
from work, and their identity is
yeah,
basically like connected with the work. So
yeah,
when they lose this, they lose everything,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
So I think it's the moment for those who unfortunately are,
yeah,
losing their jobs because of this situation, or for other situations, to untap what they really like, and maybe they can profit out of it, right?
yeah. And honestly, pivots are good. Pivots are hard, but you know what? You might come out on the other side having found something. Bet on yourself, start a business, look in another sector. There's options out there. It's scary, but maybe a lot of us will be forced to kind of reckon with that as well. But yeah, I agree. Having been there, having been the person where my job was my identity, was my everything, I can say that there's life on the other side. And having that new conceptual framework for life can be really liberating and really beautiful.
Thank you for that, Kelsey. And also, like, I'm gonna put in our description your details. Listen, community, we have Kelsey. If you need a coach focusing on social impact and so on, you can see how positive she is. And now is the time to be around positive people. Am I right?
Yeah,
Kelsey,
absolutely.
thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. I know you are a very busy person, but I've learned a lot. And, we can see at some point we're gonna meet and we're gonna have a cup
Absolutely.
of coffee, and hopefully it's gonna be better. Thank you for
Yes,
that.
in real life connection. I love it. Thanks, Andres. This was a great conversation. It was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay. Goodbye. Goodbye, everybody.